Hi, it's Sherri from A Quilting Life, and today I'm here to talk about my favorite patchwork pot holders. And I've been making these for quite a while. I don't ever buy pot holders at the store anymore. And I thought it would be fun to show you step by step how I put these together and kind of the tips and tricks that I use when I'm making these cute pot holders. Okay, so these patchwork pot holders are just my favorite to make. I really love doing the patchwork, and they're perfect for using up your scraps, and they're also perfect for using mini charm packs. And actually, 2 mini charm packs will make 5 pot holders of the smaller ones. And for the smaller ones, I use 16 squares that are 2.5 inches, and for the bigger ones, I use 20 squares. I just add an extra row. So basically, you're going to start by just picking out your squares and laying them out in a 4x4 grid. And so I've got this one already sewn together to show you, but I am going to make some more pot holders with this fabric. I haven't made any with these yet. So I've got them sewn together, and I will have a link to all of the information, and I actually have a little PDF for this as well with all the measurements and everything that I will link to. But basically, you're going to make a 4x4 grid, so a 16 patch of 2.5 inch squares, and I just pressed like this. And then you're going to want just batting, and this worked out perfect because I had just gotten a quilt back from the quilter and I had extra batting, and I just leave a little bit extra. So this is about 8.5 by 8.5, and I cut my batting at 10 inches by 10 inches. And then this is Insulbright, and this is a heat resistant material that you'll want to put in your pot holder. And then I use another square of batting as well. What I'm going to do is sandwich the Insulbright in between the 2 batting pieces. So these are all 10 inches by 10 inches. Now, from everything I've read on the package instructions, that Insulbright does not have a right or a wrong side. I mean, it looks a little bit different, but the package says that there's no right and wrong side, that both sides give you the heat resistant quality. Batting does have a right and a wrong side, but it doesn't matter for pot holders. It matters more if you're doing quilting. But kind of the rougher side is the side that if you were doing a quilt that you would want towards your backing, and the smoother side you would want towards the front of your quilt. So I always layer it with a piece of batting, my Insulbright, and another piece of batting, and so that I have the smoother sides of the batting out. And I'm going to center my pot holder top right there. Okay, so I've centered the top of my pot holder on my little sandwich that I made with batting, Insulbright, and batting. And then for the backing, the pot holder backing, I make it a little bit bigger, just because in the past when I've made it the same size as the batting and the Insulbright, I've had problems with things shifting. So I do make this bigger. This is 12 by 12, the backing. Okay, so backing is going to go wrong side up, and then we're going to put our little sandwich on top of it. And so here I'm going to have plenty of space. Now when you quilt, I actually did one of these with a walking foot and one of them without, and I feel like the one that I did with a walking foot, the smaller one, really did turn out a lot better. There are a few little puckers in this one. I just wanted to try it out and see if I could keep those puckers away without using the walking foot, but it's really hard. So if you have a walking foot, I really recommend it. Also, I did a 3.0 stitch length on this one, and I feel like it's too small. I moved my stitch length up to 3.5 for the smaller pot holder, and I really like it a lot better. It just gives more of a hand quilted look with that bigger stitch, and it also looks better on the back, the stitching with the 3.5. These are kind of small. So I just feel like you get a more professional look with that bigger stitch length. Okay, so once you have it like this, you are going to do the quilting. And I just did really simple quilting down each of the 3 vertical seam lines and each of the other cross seam lines. You could do even more and go on both sides of every seam line, but I feel like there's not really a reason. This gives you plenty of quilting. You're just wanting to hold it together. So once you've quilted it, it's going to look like this. And I did use the walking foot on this one as well. So it looks like this. I've done my quilting. You can see on the back that I also went around the outer edges of the potholder top. So, and now what I like to do is trim it, and then we're going to round these corners. I really like the rounded corners. You don't have to round the corners. If you don't want to, you can just do a square potholder. I just always think they look a little bit more professional with the rounded corners. Okay, so I'm going to trim. I'm just going to use an acrylic ruler and my rotary cutter, and I'm going to trim off these sections. Sometimes it's a little bit thick going through all the layers, but that's another reason why it really helps to sew along the edges so that everything stays together. Okay, and as I mentioned before, you can leave it square. If you're going to leave it square, you can just go ahead and make your binding and finish it now. But I like to just take that extra step that I mentioned of rounding the corners. And I'll show you what I use. I got these Creative Grids cutting circles a while ago, and it has plastic circles in all different sizes. And so I basically just use them for rounding corners on bags, potholders. And so I'm just going to use the little smallest one. It's a 2.5 inch. And I just kind of set it right up next to the edge. And I just let it be my guide, and I just round the corner. You can also use a large thread spool. You could use a small glass bowl for this. You could even make a template with template plastic, but I really like having the edge to go up against, and I feel like it just really helps. So then we've got the little trim pieces. Okay, the next thing you're going to want to do is make your binding. And what I did, I used an 18-inch square of binding, an 18-inch square of fabric to make my bias binding. And I actually think I'm going to film a video on this and show you how to do that, make that bias binding so that it's in a separate place and people can access it. So I won't show you that now. I will actually just put a link up to it. But you're going to make your bias binding. If you didn't round your corners, you can use regular binding. You don't have to worry about the bias. But if you rounded the corners, you're going to need the bias binding so that you can kind of stretch the corners, stretch the binding around the corners. And I'll show you. Oh, and here's my other one that I trimmed. But this is after I've attached the binding. And I did use bias binding. I rounded these corners and I did use the bias binding. And let me show you something that I do first. This is a little trick. I will take my iron and press the binding out with my iron so that I'm going to get a nice clean finish. But then what I'm going to do before I start sewing it is I'm just going to kind of turn it. And I can tell that it's going to be really easy for me to fold that over right there. But in these corners, it's really hard. And the reason for that is that we have so many layers. We had the potholder front, we had the potholder back, we had 2 layers of batting and 1 layer of Insulbright. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to trim some of that bulk from each of the corners so that when I go to sew it, that it's not super bulky. Okay, so I will get, and you can do it with scissors, you can do it with a rotary cutter, but I usually just kind of fold the binding back a little and I just kind of trim just a little bit more of that off. Just to get that bulk out of there. And I'm actually going to get scissors. I think it's a little bit easier to do with the scissors. Okay, so I got my scissors. It is easier. And so I'm not cutting any of the binding at all. I'm just cutting in the corner where we have all that extra batting. And so you notice that after I do this, it's going to be easy to fold that over and not have all that bulk. So yeah, so I just do that on the corners basically. Sometimes you need to do it. It just depends kind of how accurate your sewing has been, I guess. But sometimes you might need to do it on one of the sides, but usually not. Usually just the four corners that you have to do that. So once you've trimmed it, there's actually one more step that you'll want to do before you finish your binding, and that is if you want a little potholder hanger on the back. Okay, you can see that I've got these on both of my finished potholders, and I don't know if people really use these anymore. It kind of makes the back look cuter. I always put them on if I'm giving them as a gift because I just don't know if the person will want them or not, so I figure if they don't want them, they're really not in the way and they just lay flat. And if they want to use them, they can. And so the way I make these is I take a 2.5 inch by 5 inch rectangle and I will press it in half, wrong sides together like this. And then I'll press it in half again and then I'll fold it. So then I have a thin rectangle like this, and I just sew one seam right up that side where the folded edges meet. And that's how I make my little potholder tabs. And you can use this to make a tab to put on a bag. I use this same size to make hangers when I make homemade stockings. And so 2.5 inches by 5 inch is the perfect size for a tab. So if you're going to add a tab, make it. And then you will just, I use the seam and I center it on the back. And I did on this one just sew a little basting strip to keep it there so that it's already been sewn on when you fold your binding to the back. And when you fold the binding to the back, you can hand stitch it down. I use the Clover Wonder Clips. I'll grab some of those and show you how I get it all ready for stitching. Okay, as I mentioned, I really like to use the Clover Wonder Clips. I just use them to clip my binding down all around the potholder. Now I like to hand stitch binding. I know some people don't. I just really like it, and when I did these potholders the other night, I just had them ready to go. I watched the news and stitched the binding down while I had the television on. So, but if you want to machine sew them, you can as well. And so in that case, you would still want to clip it with Clover Wonder Clips. And then you can do a couple of different things. You can sew from the back side, and you can kind of feel that if you sew right along the edge of the back, it will end up in the border on the front, so the stitching won't be out here. If your measurements are off, it can be a little bit tricky to get used to machine binding. Some people, I just don't like it, but I've gotten better at it with practice. So potholders are a good way to practice machine binding. But really, these are so small, and I don't mind sitting and stitching them. I'll just finish clipping this, and then I'll have this one ready to sew. And you can tell that it was easy for me to go around all of the corners because we did trim and take out that extra batting and Insel Bright. Okay, so I've got that one clipped. It's ready to go, and I'll have another pot holder as soon as I get that finished, and I've got my little tab on the back. So I hope you enjoyed this little tutorial for my patchwork pot holders today. I really do enjoy making these. I make them in Christmas fabrics at Christmas time and just in everyday fabrics. I've made them in 4th of July fabrics. You could do whatever you want. They're super fun. Something else I do that I didn't mention earlier is that I just kind of, when I have scraps, I sometimes will just make the 16 patches or the 20 patch little pieces and just have them ready to go. And that way when I have, you know, 4 or 5, 6 of them, I can just make that many pot holders at one time, and I've already got the patchwork sections done. So anyway, I'll have all of the details linked in the description below that I mentioned throughout the video. And please subscribe if you haven't already, and thanks so much for stopping by.